Good morning, my lord.
Good morning, Miss van der Westhuizen. Now, we're going to hear from you first, I believe.
Yes, indeed, my lord. My
Thank
lord,
you.
I appear today with my learned juniors David Turner Advocate and Chris Stephen Advocate, who will be assisting me with presenting the evidence at the upcoming hearings. We're joined this morning by legal representatives of core participants who have been granted leave to appear at these hearings. 16 organisations and groups have core participant status in relation to terms of reference 2J and 2L and have been granted leave to appear at the relevant impact hearings. These are Central Care Homes Scotland, Church of Scotland, City of Edinburgh Council, Convention of Scottish Local Authorities or COSLA, Homeless Network Scotland, Long COVID Kids Scotland, PARMIS or Promoting a More Inclusive Society, Refugees for Justice, Scottish Care, Scottish COVID Bereaved, Scottish Enterprise, Scottish Hazards, Scottish Healthcare Workers Coalition, Scottish Trades Union Congress or STUC, Scottish Women's Rights Organisations or SWRO, which comprises Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland, Engender, Close the Gap and Just Right Scotland, and finally the Scottish Ministers. My lord, today is the start of the inquiry's public impact hearings for one of its four main investigative portfolios, namely Portfolio 2, which covers the inquiry's terms of reference 2L and J, which relate to business and welfare support. The hearings will run for approximately 2.5 weeks and will conclude on the 18th of December 2024. We'll be sitting for 5 days this week, from Monday to Friday, for 4 days next week, on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, and for 2.5 days the following week, from Monday to Wednesday. My lord, as I did at the start of the Portfolio 4 impact hearings and in setting the scene for what's to follow at these hearings, I'll provide a reminder of the rationale for the approach being taken, and in doing so I propose firstly to make a few observations about the background to the inquiry and its approach to impact evidence generally. Secondly, to address a number of matters relevant to the investigation and gathering of impact evidence, specifically relating to business and welfare support. And this will include providing an outline of the scope of Portfolio 2, a reminder of the engagement undertaken and impact evidence gathered by the Portfolio 2 legal team, and an overview of an update on the continuing work of the inquiry's listening project, Let's Be Heard. Thirdly, I will be proposed to outline the approach being taken to the presentation of evidence at these impact hearings and to provide an overview of the organisations from whom we'll be hearing evidence. And fourthly, I propose to address a few general procedural matters, including immediate next steps. My lord, turning first to the inquiry's background and general approach, I will again be referring to relevant parts of the inquiry's terms of reference and also outline the inquiry's general approach to impact hearings, and that's in order to provide context for the approach being taken to the presentation of evidence at these hearings. In relation to the terms of reference, as your lordship is well aware, the aim of the inquiry is set out in paragraph 1 and is to establish the facts of and to learn lessons from the strategic response of the COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland. The inquiry's scope is set out in paragraph 2 and is to investigate the strategic elements of the handling of the pandemic relating to 12 areas, and 2 of those relate to business and welfare support. With the exception of pandemic planning, the inquiry's investigations into the handling of the pandemic are required to cover the period between 1 January 2020 and 31 December 2022. It is nevertheless recognised that some of the impacts of decisions to lock down and apply other restrictions are still felt today. We may therefore hear evidence, my lord, of experiences since 2022, which, being impacts relating to the handling of the pandemic during the 2020 to 2022 reference period, are still within the scope of the inquiry's investigations. Paragraph 5 of the terms of reference requires the inquiry to demonstrate how a human rights-based approach has contributed to its findings and recommendations. And paragraph 7 requires the inquiry, where your lordship deems it appropriate and necessary, to consider, firstly, the impacts of the strategic elements of the handling of the pandemic on the exercise of convention rights, and secondly, any disparities in the strategic elements of the handling of the pandemic, including unequal impacts on people. My Lord, in terms of the general approach to impact hearings, the inquiry, as your Lordship is well aware, has adopted a thematic approach and is considering evidence about the impacts of the strategic response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland under a number of themes. We've now already heard impact evidence in relation to health and social care and also in relation to education and certification. Focusing initially on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the strategic response is consistent with the commitment the inquiry is taking to a person-centred, human rights-based approach. Having an understanding of the nature and extent of the key impacts and issues and where and by whom they were most keenly felt enables the inquiry to focus its ongoing investigations into implementation and decision-making appropriately. As regards impacts relating to business and welfare support specifically, the portfolio team has engaged largely again with organisations, although there has also been direct engagement with a number of individuals. In the time available during the upcoming impact hearings, we will be hearing oral evidence from organisations rather than from individuals. For individuals, the main vehicle for sharing personal experiences continues to be the inquiry's public participation project, Let's Be Heard. My Lord, as I explained at the preliminary hearing, one of the main reasons for adopting this approach is because the impacts relating to business and welfare support are ones that were felt particularly widely across society and affected whole sectors and communities rather than specific groups. Organisations are also likely to have a greater breadth of information about and insight into the extent to which impacts were experienced. They are able to reflect the collective views of their members and to provide a more comprehensive overview of the relevant impacts and issues. My Lord, I'll now turn to address three matters relevant to the investigation and gathering of impact evidence relating to business and welfare support. These include the scope of Investigative Portfolio 2, the engagement undertaken and impact evidence gathered so far by the Portfolio 2 legal team, and an overview of an update on the continuing work of the Inquiry's listening project Let's Be Heard, insofar as it's relevant to business and welfare support. In terms of its scope, Investigative Portfolio 2 covers paragraphs 2J and L of the inquiry's terms of reference, which require the inquiry to investigate the strategic handling of the pandemic relating specifically to, in the case of J, welfare assistance programs, for example, those relating to benefits or the provision of food, provided or supported by public agencies, and in the case of L, financial support and guidance given to businesses and the self-employed, including in relation to the identification of key workers by public agencies. In terms of engagement and evidence, as your Lordship pointed out at the preliminary hearing, oral evidence from witnesses during the public hearings is only one way in which the inquiry can gather evidence. In relation to impact evidence specifically, the portfolio team has received approximately 64 responses to Rule 8 requests, has taken around 53 statements, and has held 27 roundtable discussions with various organisations and businesses. These statements, Rule 8 responses, and reports have been reviewed and will form the basis of a narrative record of the impact evidence relating to business and welfare support, which will also include evidence heard at these hearings. It will highlight the key impacts and issues that have been identified and is due to be published during the course of 2025. And the portfolio team is very grateful to all those who have given their time to assist the inquiry so far with its investigations. As regards the engagement by Let's Be Heard, as I emphasised at the preliminary hearings and in the opening statement for the portfolio 4 impact hearings, although we will be hearing evidence from organisations rather than from individuals at these impact hearings, the inquiry is nevertheless interested in hearing about the personal experiences of those impacts. The inquiry's participation project, public participation project Let's Be Heard, was set up in order to give everyone affected by the strategic response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Scotland the chance to share their experiences with the inquiry directly. Let's Be Heard has the capacity to gather and collate individual accounts on a scale that the inquiry could not reasonably do through oral evidence, witness statements, or Rule 8 responses. During its national engagement period, which ran between May and December 2023, experiences relating to business and welfare support were shared with the inquiry via Let's Be Heard through various methods. People from across Scotland completed the General Individual Experiences form online and on paper, which covers all aspects of the inquiry's terms of reference and asks people to speak about what is most important to them. Let's Be Heard attended 12 group discussions, hearing from more than 100 people on general themes where aspects of business and/or welfare were discussed. Let's Be Heard has also gathered existing data and information about people's experiences in relation to aspects of welfare through 31 reports from external stakeholders. Let's Be Heard published a preliminary report on the early findings in November 2023. During 2024, Let's Be Heard has continued to analyse people's experiences and has adopted a more targeted approach through its focused engagement period. During this period, it's been employing various methods to hear further experiences relating specifically, again, to business and welfare support. This has included engagement with businesses and with organisations delivering welfare assistance, as well as with individuals in receipt of such assistance. Let's Be Heard members, as I've said before, my Lord, are part of the inquiry team. They've been working closely with the Portfolio 2 legal team in relation to engagement with organisations and individuals regarding impacts relevant to business and welfare support. On 6 June 2024, as part of its focused engagement period, Let's Be Heard launched a survey for businesses in order to understand the impacts of the pandemic on individual businesses and their owners. That survey, my Lord, was developed in conjunction with the Portfolio 2 legal team, and a total of 290 responses have been received. The survey work has been complemented by a number of group discussions for business owners run by the Let's Be Heard team. In relation to business and welfare support, Let's Be Heard has held group discussions with specific audiences to understand more about access to benefits, food and fuel poverty, housing and homelessness, and business support. 43 group discussions were held, which were arranged through 22 different organisations. It has been important for the inquiry through Let's Be Heard to engage with a range of people, businesses and organisations with different sets of circumstances in order to understand better the unequal impacts felt across different societal groups. Let's Be Heard will be publishing a series of reports based on key findings, which will support the inquiry's ongoing investigations and inform its reports and its recommendations. My Lord, I will now turn to outline the approach being taken to the presentation of evidence at these impact hearings and will provide an overview of the organisations from whom we will be hearing. In terms of presentation of the evidence, between us, Mr. Turner, Mr. Stephen and I will be leading a variety of witnesses who have been selected with a view to ensuring that the hearings cover evidence on a range of key impacts and issues. There will be a combination of single witnesses and panel sessions of between 2 and 5 witnesses. The various hearing slots are scheduled to last between 1 and 2 hours. In order to accommodate breaks for the stenographers, there will be a 15-minute break between each witness slot. If we finish a particular witness a bit earlier, that break will be slightly longer, as was the case with the Portfolio 4 impact hearings. Again, as with the Portfolio 4 impact hearings, my Lord, witnesses will be led on the basis of their witness statements, Rule 8 responses and/or round table reports as appropriate. Those have already been disclosed to core participants and will be published on the inquiry's website on the morning on the day on which a witness is due to give evidence. In the relatively short time available, witnesses will not be able to speak to everything covered in their witness statements or Rule 8 responses, and their oral evidence will focus on issues of particular relevance for each witness or those they represent, with a view to, insofar as possible, avoiding repetition. The impact hearings will highlight and provide an overview of some of the key issues and impacts experienced by individuals and organisations relating to business and welfare support, including impacts on businesses and the self-employed, impacts on individuals in the context of welfare assistance programs, and impacts on organisations that delivered welfare assistance during the pandemic. To allow the inquiry to report as soon as practicable, as required by paragraph 6 of its terms of reference. The majority of the impact evidence held by the inquiry relating to business and welfare assistance cannot be covered at these hearings. However, this evidence, which includes witness statements, Rule 8 responses and expert reports, as well as reports of roundtable meetings and other documentary evidence, will nevertheless be reflected in the narrative record I've already mentioned. My Lord, in terms of the order of evidence, we propose to start with witnesses who speak to issues and impacts relevant to business support, followed by those broadly who speak to issues relevant to welfare support, although it must be acknowledged that there is a degree of overlap between the two. In terms of witnesses in relation to business support, we will be calling witnesses from general business and sector-specific representative bodies, together with representatives of employees, and that'll be as follows. We'll be hearing firstly from the Federation of Small Businesses Scotland, or FSB, which is a cross-sectoral direct membership organisation representing small businesses and the self-employed. It has approximately 150,000 members across the UK, with around 15,000 in Scotland, and with members in both business-to-business and business-to-consumer industries from a wide range of sectors, about which we'll be hearing more this morning. Next, we'll be hearing from the Scottish Retail Consortium, or SRC, which is a trade organisation for Scotland's retailers. It has around 300 members and represents retailers of scale covering every subset of retail industry in Scotland. We'll also be hearing from Scottish Wholesale Association, which is the trade body for Scotland's food and drink wholesaling sector. Its members deliver food and drink to a variety of industries, including hospitality, catering, tourism and leisure business, as well as public sector establishments, including schools, hospitals, prisons and care homes. Its membership ranges from family-run single depot businesses to large wholesalers with a number of depots. We'll further be hearing from the Food and Drink Federation, which is a major UK trade association that represents food and drink manufacturers. We'll be hearing from the Scottish Hospitality Group, which is an organisation formed during the COVID-19 pandemic to represent the interests of hospitality organisations in Scotland, and which has a membership comprising both large hospitality businesses and single-site businesses. We'll hear from the National Hair and Beauty Federation, which is the UK's largest trade body for the hair and beauty sector, with around 5,000 members. We'll be hearing from the British Dental Association, which is the professional association and trade union for dentists practising in the UK, representing all fields of dentistry. Since its inception in 1880, I understand it's been the voice of dentistry in the UK. We'll be hearing from the Confederation of Passenger Transport UK, which is a trade association representing operators of the UK buses and coaches, including those that operate registered bus services, intercity coaches, coach tourism, and other such forms of road-based mass transit. We'll be hearing from the Scottish Tourism Alliance, which is a membership organisation for tourism and Scottish hospitality businesses in Scotland. It comprises approximately 250 trade associations, businesses, destination groups, and other organisations with an interest in tourism and hospitality, with its members spread across all regions in Scotland. We'll be hearing from the Association of Scotland Self-Caterers, which has more than 1,700 members, supports the operation of tens of thousands of self-catering properties across Scotland, and is the leading source of knowledge and advocacy for Scotland's self-catering sector. We'll be hearing from Scottish Lands and Estates, which represents those who own and manage rural land, property and land-based businesses, as well as those who provide services and trades for them. We'll be hearing from the British Veterinary Association, which is the national representative body for the veterinary profession in the United Kingdom. It has over 19,000 members across the UK and over 2,000 in Scotland, and its aim is to represent and support the interests of the veterinary profession. We'll be hearing from the Scottish Association of Landlords, which is the only dedicated national organisation representing landlords and letting agents throughout Scotland, although we'll be hearing from them slightly later in the proceedings with other property relevant evidence in the course of next week. In relation to trade unions, my lord, we'll be hearing from the Scottish Trades Unions Congress, or STUC, which is Scotland's trade union centre or grouping of trade unions. It represents over 550,000 workers through its 40 affiliated trade unions and 20 trade union councils. Its purpose is described as being to coordinate, develop and articulate the views and policies of the trade union movement in Scotland. Further, in relation to trade unions, we'll be hearing from the Union of Shop, Distribution and Allied Workers, which is an independent trade union for retail workers. We'll be hearing from the Scottish Artists Union, which is a trade union and representative voice for visual and applied artists in Scotland. It was established to improve the working conditions of those artists in Scotland and to raise awareness of the condition of artists to the public life and economy of Scotland. We'll be hearing from Scottish Hazards, which is a charitable organisation involved in promoting advancement of health and the saving of lives in the work environment. Then, my lord, in relation to welfare support, we'll be calling witnesses from the Cora Foundation, which is an independent grant-making foundation that distributes its own funds and also partners with other funders to distribute funds collectively and or on their behalf. We'll be hearing from a panel made up of representatives of Citizens Advice Edinburgh, Citizens Advice Dundee and Citizens Advice Scotland. We'll be hearing from Scottish Care, which is a registered charity and membership organisation representing independent social care services in Scotland. We'll be hearing from Social Enterprise Scotland, which is an independent membership organisation that promotes and campaigns on behalf of all social enterprises in Scotland. We'll be hearing from the Poverty Alliance, which is a charity whose purpose is to build a strong network to prevent and reduce poverty. It campaigns for policy changes at the local, national and UK levels to address the root causes of poverty, such as low wages, lack of affordable housing and social inequality. We'll be hearing from the Child Poverty Action Group, which is a UK-wide charitable organisation whose aim is to prevent child poverty through campaigning and advice provision. We'll be hearing from Fuel and a panel of organisations on the subject of fuel poverty and fuel crisis. That panel will include representatives from the Fuel Bank Foundation, which is the only charity in the UK to focus on challenges of people living in fuel crisis. It provides emergency financial support through its network of partners and identifies people who cannot afford to prepay for their fuel and energy. On that panel, we'll also be hearing from Citrus Energy, which is a social enterprise subsidiary of Cunningham Housing Association. It supports residential tenants as well as businesses, charities and social enterprises and provides advice about reducing energy bills. Further on that panel, we'll be hearing from Queen's Cross Housing Association, which is a community-based housing association providing nearly 4,500 homes in an area that stretches from north from Glasgow city centre along either side of the Forth and Clyde Canal. We'll then be hearing from Citizens Advice Scotland, which is a registered charity that supports Scottish Citizens Advice Bureau. We'll be hearing from a panel of people who work for housing associations, which are members of the Forum of Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum of Housing Associations, or GWSF. That forum is the membership and campaigning body for local community-controlled or community-based housing associations and cooperatives in the west of Scotland. And that panel will include representatives from Linthouse Housing Association, Castletown Housing Association, Govan Housing Association and Dalmuir Park Housing Association. My Lord, we'll be hearing a further panel of representatives of organisations involved with the Independent Food Aid Network, or IFAN, and the Trust Network, which will include West Lothian Food Bank, Trussell Trust, Kirkcaldy Food Bank, Pollock Shields Community Food Point. We'll be hearing from another food-related panel. We'll be hearing from a panel of representatives of third sector organisations involved in the provision of food, namely Space at Broomhouse Hub, which is a Scottish charity that champions community development and bringing people together, and which delivers 17 projects with the help of more than 70 staff and 250 volunteers, and provides a diverse service supporting young people, families, older people and carers. Part of that second food panel will also be Edinburgh Food Social, which is a social enterprise working towards food justice by educating and empowering young people and communities to engage with local and seasonal food. Further on that panel, we'll be hearing from Scottish Highlands and Islands and Maori Chinese Association, which provides a platform and provides a voice for the Chinese community, access to information and the provision of activities for older members. And finally, on that food-related panel, there will be North United Communities, which is an organisation dedicated to strengthening the community that wants children, young people and their families to lead happy, healthier lives. My Lord, we'll be hearing from quite a few panels during these impact hearings. We'll be hearing from another panel, which will comprise representatives of organisations that are members of the Human Rights Consortium Scotland, which is the civil society network to defend and promote human rights in Scotland. And that panel will include representatives of Interfaith Scotland, which is a membership organisation that promotes and facilitates constructive engagement between different faith and belief communities across Scotland. Equality Network, which works for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex equality and human rights in Scotland. East Ayrshire Advocacy Services, which provides a free independent advocacy service enabling local people with support to be heard. And finally, on the Human Rights Consortium panel, we'll have Welfare Scotland, which provides a range of welfare rights advice and support services, including support in housing disputes, landlord issues, social housing applications, benefits advice, and consumer rights complaints. My Lord, we will then be hearing from a representative of Roots Out and Trafficking Awareness Raising Alliance, or TARA. Roots Out and Trafficking Awareness Raising Alliance, Alliance, or TARA. In this regard, Roots Out is a service that offers advice, information, and support to women who sell sex and is part of the Community Safety Glasgow, whereas TARA provides support to women who may be trafficked and exploited and works with them to provide trauma-informed, practical, emotional support to help them recover from their experiences and also provides crisis accommodation. We'll be hearing from another panel of representatives of organisations who offer befriending services, namely Visiting Friends, which provides volunteer befrienders for any adult in Helensburgh and Lomond who might be feeling lonely or isolated. Cowell Elderly Befrienders, which provides a range of befriending services designed to improve quality of life, reduce isolation and loneliness, and keep older people independent and active as long as possible. We'll be hearing from Caradin Yush. I'm sorry, my Gaelic pronunciation is not great.
Probably better than mine.
Caradin Yush, I think is how you pronounce it, a befriending organisation tackling loneliness and social isolation across 5 island communities of Eriskay, South Uist, Benbecula, North Uist and Bernary. And Highland Hospice is the 4th member of that panel, which provides a specialist palliative care in the Highlands as well as befriending and support services throughout the Highlands. My Lord, we'll be hearing from Includem, a Scottish charity working with children and young people in care and their caregivers. We'll also be hearing a panel of representatives of the organisation BEMIS, or members of the organisation BEMIS, and that will include Phoenix Counselling, which supports integration and aims to improve the well-being of the Central Eastern European community in Edinburgh. Women in Action, which supports and empowers women to reach their full potential through education, building healthy relationships with their children. African Women's Group Scotland, which promotes equality, the development and advancement of women of African origin and descent in Scotland. And the final member of that panel will be the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities, which represents the organised Jewish community in Scotland, advancing the public understanding about the Jewish religion, culture and community. We'll also be hearing, my Lord, from a panel of members of the Scottish Refugee Council, which is Scotland's national refugee charity, which supports thousands of men, women and children every year as they rebuild their lives in Scotland. That panel will be made up of representatives of 2 member organisations, namely the West of Scotland Regional Equality Council, which is an organisation based in Glasgow that works with communities across all equality strands to develop and deliver community-led responses to eliminate discrimination, attain rights and remove barriers in order to build a fair and just society. And the second member of that panel is the Forth Valley Welcome, which is a Scottish charity working in Stirling and Clackmannanshire to support resettlement of vulnerable refugees and others with similar needs. We'll be hearing then, my Lord, from One Parent Families Scotland, which supports one-parent families by giving advice, signposting services, assisting with financial issues and advocating on their behalf. And then the final panel we'll be hearing from, my Lord, on the last day will be a panel of representatives of disabled people's organisations that are all members of Inclusion Scotland. Inclusion Scotland is a national network of disabled people, their organisations and allies, and the panel will include representatives of Glasgow Disability Alliance, which is the disabled people-led organisation controlled by more than 5,500 disabled members across Greater Glasgow. DG Voice, which is a region-wide organisation of disabled people in Dumfries and Galloway, and People First Scotland, which is the national disabled people's organisation of adults with a learning disability in Scotland. So, my Lord, that's the extent of the oral evidence we'll be hearing. I'll now turn just to address briefly three matters relating to procedure and next steps. And these are the restriction on the disclosure of information, the Rule 9 procedure, and closing submissions. In relation to the restriction on the disclosure of information, as mentioned at the preliminary hearing, my Lord, there are currently no restriction orders pertaining specifically to the inquiry's investigation of matters covered by terms of reference 2J and L relating to business and welfare support, or in relation to any of the witnesses who will be giving evidence at these hearings. There is, however, a general restriction order that covers witness statements, documents, and all other evidence, information, and material that is either provided to or generated by the inquiry and shared with core participants and other recipients, which operates to restrict their disclosure or publication prior to publication by the inquiry itself, and a copy of that is available on the inquiry's website. As I've already mentioned, material for each of the witnesses has already been disclosed to the core participants with leave to appear, and witness statements, Rule 8 responses, and or roundtable reports that are relevant to the witnesses giving evidence on a particular day will be published on the inquiry website on the morning of the day that witness is due to give evidence. But prior to that, protected material should not be disclosed by core participants or their legal representatives. As further mentioned, my Lord, in relation to Rule 9 procedure, as I mentioned at the preliminary hearing, your Lordship has issued guidance in relation to Rule 9, and that is available on the inquiry website and sets out the relevant procedure applicable. And just as a reminder for core participants, it requires informal approaches to be made to counsel through the inquiry mailbox no later than 1 week before a witness gives evidence, with suggestions of relevant questions or topics. It provides a formal procedure for applications to be made to your Lordship no later than 2 working days before the relevant witnesses to give evidence in the event that counsel is not minded to ask the questions suggested. And finally, my Lord, it provides that your Lordship will consider applications to question a witness at the conclusion of the evidence, but that is restricted to information that has arisen during the course of the evidence that is material, relevant, and new. And finally, my Lord, in relation to closing statements, your Lordship has issued a direction in relation to closing statements for this set of hearings, in terms of which, as with Portfolio 4 impact hearings, core participants with leave to appear may, if they so wish, submit a written closing statement to the inquiry by no later than 12 noon on the 29th of January 2025, and that's to be no longer than 2,500 words, and should have regard to the terms of the appendix to that direction. My Lord, unless I can be of further assistance, those are opening statement for the inquiry.
Thank you very much, Ms van der Westhuizen. That's very helpful. We'll now take a break before we start with the evidence, and we'll come back at 11 o'clock for that purpose. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my Lord. Welcome back, my lord.
Yes, good afternoon, good morning, I beg your pardon again, Ms van der Westerhuizen. Now you have a panel for us now.
We do, my lord. We have a panel of 3 representatives of the Federation of Small Businesses. We have Mr. Borland, who's the Director of Devolved Nations. We have Mr. Clark, who is the East of Scotland Development Manager, and Mr. Groundwater, who is the Regional Development Manager for Scotland.
Very good. Good morning, Mr. Borland, Mr. Clark, and Mr. Groundwater. Thank you very much. Right, now, when you're ready, Ms van der Westerhuizen.
Thank you, my lord. If I could start just by asking you each to confirm in turn, perhaps starting with Mr. Borland and working down the line, just to confirm your full names and to provide a brief overview of your role now and during the pandemic and what it entailed.
Yes, good morning. My name is Colin Borland. I'm FSB's Director of Devolved Nations, which means that I look after the staff teams in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So during the pandemic, my main role in Scotland was to oversee the management of the teams in our what was our Glasgow office and our field teams as well, directly supporting members.
Thank you. Mr. Clark?
I'm Gary Clark. I am FSB's Development Manager for the East of Scotland area. So I look after our members across Edinburgh and the Lothians, Fife and the Borders. During the pandemic, I was in that role and was engaged very directly with member businesses and indeed non-member businesses affected by issues around the pandemic. I was also involved with engaging with local authorities during that time, and to some extent Scottish Government officials as well.
Thank you. And Mr. Groundwater?
Morning, David Groundwater. So I'm currently the Regional Development Manager for Scotland, but during the time of the COVID pandemic I was in a similar role to Gary there, but my geographical area was the northeast of Scotland, so from Tayside, Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire and the Moray area.
Thank you very much. My Lord, just for reference, we have a witness statement, and that has been signed by Mr. Borland, and the reference for your Lordship it can be found under WT 0514. We also have a Rule 8 response from the FSB, which is SCI FSB XXX dash 000006. And 4 case studies have also been lodged. I won't give the references for those now, but we may come on to speak about them, in which case I will provide those references. I think this is not a traditional panel in the sense that we don't have a roundtable report, but we do have effectively 3 witnesses speaking to 1 witness statement. So what I'm going to do is, given that Mr. Borland is the deponent or the signature of the witness statement, I'll direct the questions to the panel, but Mr. Borland, if you could possibly indicate, if you're not going to be answering it, which of your 2 colleagues will be taking the lead on any particular area or aspect that we discussed, just for the stenographer to be able to record who's speaking. Thank you. I think if we could start just before we get into the substance of things, just to get an overview of the FSB and FSB Scotland. In particular, if you could please provide an overview of FSB Scotland and FSB, including the aims, composition of the membership and the sectors of operation, please.
Yes, certainly. FSB were founded in 1974. We are a direct member, a business organisation. We were initially set up to represent the interests of the self-employed, and to this day 45% of our members are self-employed individuals with no staff. Another 45% have fewer than 10 employees, so therefore 90% of the membership is in that micro category. We are cross-sectoral, so we don't represent any one particular sector. We're not dominated by a particular sector. We broadly reflect the economy as it is, and we might come on to talk more about this later, but also we represent people who don't necessarily fit neatly into a particular sector and maybe have interests across some sectors. What we do is we provide our members with support, advice and services. So we have things like a 24/7 legal advice helpline. We have a tax protection service. We are also within the group. We also have a specialist insurance broker, FSB Insurance Services. Essentially giving the self-employed and micro businesses access to services that they otherwise couldn't get because of our buying power. We also lobby on behalf of the small business interests in general, to make Scotland and indeed the UK the best place it possibly can be to do business. And we have colleagues like Gary and David, who are supporting members on the ground, rather like a constituency MSP or MP, making representations on behalf of members and trying to right wrongs or cut through issues where that's required.
And is that representations on the ground, is that to local authorities, or who are the representations?
It can be to local authorities, it can be to large PLCs, any agency effectively that comes into contact with our members and, you know, maybe causes them issues.
Thank you. And just in terms of, you've indicated that 90% of your members are on the micro end of the scale. Are you able to give it sort of approximately what percentage of Scottish businesses were small businesses, including micro, at the start of the pandemic?
About 93%.
83?
93.
93%, thank you. You've given an indication of some of the key services that FSB normally provides. Could you please just give an indication of how FSB normally, or FSB Scotland normally communicates and engages with its members, and how that changed during the pandemic?
I mean, we use the channels that they use, so things that you'd expect, like social media, email, newsletters, etc. Also direct people come to us to tell us things as well. Obviously, during the pandemic, the face-to-face element of that disappeared. Beforehand, it was a mix. Then during the pandemic, it was, you know, remotely only, and now latterly, as, you know, things have got more back to normal, we've returned to that hybrid model.
Thank you. And you've given an indication of the sort of key services you provide in normal times. Are you able to just give a summary of the services that FSB provided to members during the pandemic, just an overview of those services? I
mean, I think in addition to the sort of standard member benefits, what we were able to do was make representations on their behalf. So some cases, I mean, again, we might come on to talk about this in a bit more detail, but if people were finding it quite difficult to maybe cut through some bureaucracy, or they were finding that rules were perhaps being interpreted in a way that they disagreed with, or in a way it seemed illogical, then we could intercede on their behalf, make that point to the individual decision maker, but we'd also have colleagues who are pointing that out to the people who are setting the policy or setting the guidance, and they say, do you understand how this is working? Is this what you intended? Because this is the outcome. So we could approach it from both sides.
Thank you. And we'll come on in a minute to discuss the national extent of FSB's communication with the Scottish Government and local authority during the pandemic, but there's a reference in your witness statement to a small business survey that was published in June 2023. Did FSB carry out any surveys during the pandemic? Or if not, what other means did it use to ingather the views of its members and the concerns that they were experiencing?
We publish a quarterly small business index, which we did throughout the pandemic, where we ask a set of tracker questions about the sorts of issues that are facing your business. I mean, I don't think there would be any surprises in what that data showed in terms of what footfall was like, what confidence was like, what costs were doing. So yes, we get that feedback in that way. We also have regular events, particularly during COVID, a lot of online events, a lot of online information events and discussion, people saying, how should I comply with this particular regulation? What does this mean in my business? How does that apply? And we had some experts talking to them. So from those sorts of interactions, we got a lot of feedback back. And again, as I said, we also get people coming directly to us and saying, can you help me cut through this? Can you explain this? And that's how we managed to get that feedback and that feeling for what was happening on the ground.
Thank you. And you obviously had services that you provided to your members. Were those extended at all to those other than your members during the pandemic period?
I mean, generally, if someone was on the phone looking for advice, we would help them, show them where to go and point them in the right direction. We would tell them what we knew.
Thank you. Just turning to the communication engagement that you had with the Scottish Government and local authorities, could you please just give an overview or just describe how that happened, just in terms of the means of the communication in the first instance, and then the lobbying that you did during that period?
I mean, yeah, one thing I remember was that right at the start of the pandemic, the Scottish Government hadn't really embraced the joys of video conferencing. So a lot of phone calls on speakerphones and those sorts of setups until, you know, there's something a bit more robust was in place. I mean, there were, as you would expect, regular contact, meetings, two-way process. Many groups were set up, but too many to enumerate now. But we were a member of a number of groups, and that over time formalised into a sort of a group of the main cross-sectoral business organisations, plus some of the key sectoral bodies, who would meet with senior officials, because there was a feeling at some point that we weren't quite engaging at maybe senior management level, and maybe that we weren't quite getting those messages across to people who needed to hear them. So that's why those regular meetings were instituted. And from memory, I think they happened initially there was maybe about 3 times a week, and then as restrictions eased, they were down to weekly. And I believe it still meets in some form or other, but now it's about quarterly.
Thank you. And you also discuss in your statement the involvement in Scottish Government advisory groups and governance groups. Was that group that you mentioned, was that separate or in addition to those ones that you refer to in your statement, the various groups?
Forgive me, I can't remember exactly which ones that we list there, but...
It's quite a long list. Paragraph 47, you say the principal means of communication was through regular online meetings and major business representatives and sectoral bodies and senior Scottish Government and other officials. These initially took place several times a week with frequency dropping. And then you've got governance groups and you've got business organisations, and you list a number of those there.
Yeah, it would be covered under, sorry to interrupt you, but it would be covered under A.
Pardon?
That would be covered under 48A.
48A, so this particular one that you mentioned
Yes.
that was set up was,
Yes.
was that? Okay, thank you. And in terms of lobbying, could you please just give an outline of the type of lobbying activities that you were involved in? Was that through these meetings, or was there separate lobbying that was done?
It was both. It was both. I mean, think through the meetings, that was helpful to feedback what was happening and the general feeling and what people were reporting, and also to get an update as well from the medical experts and and officials of what was happening there. But we would also have ongoing, quite detailed discussions with specific policy officials, or indeed local government officials as well, and then even the people who would be sort of on the ground enforcing, so like environmental health officers, people, so pretty much at every level we would be having those discussions about how is this working in practice, how are you interpreting this, what is it our members need to know, and us also saying this is the feedback that we're getting. Do you have an answer to this particular question, or how would this scenario be treated? So it was very much one-to-one, but as in addition to those sort of more formal networks that we mentioned there.
Okay, thank you. And were there any other key, we'll come on to speak about the impacts on members in general terms, but any other significant ways in which FSB supported small businesses and the self-employed during the pandemic that you want to flag now before we move on to discuss impacts?
I mean, I think obviously we're talking about the Scottish support here, but obviously it was a UK-wide effort, and we were also lobbied, and through our colleagues in Westminster, lobbying the UK government to make sure that some of the acute financial pressures that people were facing were mitigated.
We'll come on shortly to discuss the financial support, which is really the main aspect that you cover, I think, in both your Rule 8 response and in your witness statement, the financial support and some of the issues and impacts relating to that. But before we do, I'd just like to get a general overview of some of the specific issues that members were experiencing as a consequence of the pandemic and the strategic response, just your members and small businesses generally. So you've already provided an overview of the typical size and nature of the small businesses and your membership in Scotland, and the percentage of self-employed individuals that make up your membership. Could you provide an indication of the size and nature of the majority of businesses that were affected by the pandemic and the restrictions in Scotland? Did that correlate with your membership?
I mean, it's difficult to generalise. What I would say is that the official Business in Scotland statistics suggest that in the first year of the pandemic, we lost 20,000 businesses from the Scottish economy, and the vast majority of them were small. And again, on the one hand, small businesses can be very good at pivoting. They can be very agile and nimble, but at the same time, they don't have the deep pockets of a large international corporate, for example. How much of that was attributable to businesses which may have been in distress initially and may not have made it through that year? How much is directly attributable to the pandemic? Correlation, causation, not entirely sure. But it's interesting that you'd been in a relatively stable amount, and then that year we lost 20,000. The next time that we lost 20,000 from that was during the cost of doing business crisis and the Ukraine war and everything that flowed from that. So that would tend to suggest to us that there was a link.
Thank you. In terms of, at paragraph 56 and following, you've got a discussion about sectoral and geographical impacts. Could you please just give an indication, were there any noticeable or notable differences in the impacts experienced by businesses in particular sectors or across geographical areas of Scotland, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's slightly more complicated than that. I'll maybe ask Mr. Clark just to share his thoughts on that, if I may.
Yes, I think it is a complex situation as you looked at the impact, and particularly at various stages of the pandemic. So initially, in that first phase in March 2020 of the pandemic, obviously almost every business was instructed to close its doors at that point. And I think in the initial phase, it was about everyone was affected equally, but not everyone was accessing the financial support equally. And we'll come back to financial support later, so I don't want to dwell too much upon that. But obviously only businesses who had premises were compensated financially in that very early stage, that first couple of weeks of the pandemic. And although it took longer than that to get the money out in some cases. So there was that differential between businesses with premises and those without premises. And if you look at the makeup of our membership, I think you referred to the survey in 2023 that we ran after the pandemic. I think around about a third, just over a third of our members operate from home, and another just under 20%, I think, operate from shared premises or from vehicles. So obviously those businesses were perhaps struggling more at first. Obviously things changed as the restrictions changed, and as restrictions were more based around the ability of a business to operate, and if you weren't allowed to operate, then you received financial support. But we'll cover the financial support later. But yeah, I think in the very early stages, it was more to do with the type of business, because those businesses without premises were the ones who weren't initially compensated in the first round of compensation.
And what about the interplay between where you're located and the type of business? Is there a relationship there that makes it more complicated to determine whether it was, for example, rural versus urban, or?
Yeah, I mean, some parts of the country obviously have a different demographic in terms of the local business population. Obviously, here in Edinburgh, where I was representing members, there's quite a strong retail make-up amongst members, quite a strong accommodation and hospitality make-up among members, creative industries. Whereas if you go into the more rural areas, you see more agricultural businesses who more of those were essential businesses during the pandemic and could continue to operate in some way to provide food supply. So there was a difference between area to area.
Thank you. There's reference to debt in the witness statement. What were the key impacts on businesses in terms of debt and resilience?
Well, I suppose, that finance was vital to get them out the other side, so there was obviously a positive impact from those schemes. But of course, it was finance that businesses weren't expecting to take on, that they hadn't planned for. Some people took it out thinking it's an insurance policy, but then ended up using it, and having to rely on it. And one of the things that happened was that, because we didn't know what was around the corner at that point, but when we emerged from COVID, we had a brief respite, and then we had the inflation crisis, the energy crisis, the cost of doing business crisis, and everything else. So it made people less resilient because they were servicing that debt and carrying that debt to be able to deal with those external shocks.
And just in terms of generally mental health and well-being, you touch on this again in your statement. Are you able to comment on the nature and extent of any mental health and well-being impacts experienced by small business owners and self-employed and their employees during the pandemic?
I mean, only anecdotally, but yes, we all spoke to people who are incredibly distressed. And if you're running a small business, it's not just a job, it's your family finances can be tied up in it, your family home, your vehicles, you might have family members that work there. You're also acutely aware of your responsibilities to your employees, to your customers, to your wider community, and all of that pressure bearing down on you when you just don't know what's going to happen, what's going to end. We did have people who were incredibly distressed, who were worried they were going to lose everything they'd worked to build up over decades, in some instances. So, yeah, I think the impact from what we saw and what we picked up from people was certainly significant.
Thank you. And just in terms of your staff, we obviously won't have time to talk too much about the impacts on FSB generally, but in terms of your staff members dealing with people and these the calls coming in, were there any particular impacts on your staff members from that perspective?
Yeah, we had to make sure. I mean, we were supporting each other, we were talking to each other every day, we were sharing these sorts of things, and many of our people who are frontline are good at dealing with people, that they're employed to deal with people. But the level of distress that they were dealing with was unusual, and we did make sure that training was available to ensure that they knew how to handle those calls, and where maybe to signpost someone who was in extreme distress.
Thank you. I think we can turn now to discuss financial support, and I think if we can start just in terms of the early identification of gaps in financial support, which you discuss in paragraph 70 to 73 of your witness statement. There you explain that much of FSB Scotland's initial engagement with government was to inform it of where the gaps were, and that this then subsequently became a major priority for you in terms of lobbying. Could you please describe how FSB Scotland worked in the early stages to identify the gaps in initial finance support schemes introduced by the UK and specifically the Scottish governments, and what those initial gaps were?
Yeah, I'll hand over to Mr Groundwater in a second to expand on that in a bit more detail, but I think the short answer is it was the feedback we were getting from the ground and what our members were feeding back to us, and that's what we in turn fed back up the line.
Thank you. Mr Groundwater.
Thank you. And indeed, I mean, the first scheme that was, or the first schemes that were announced by the Scottish Government focused on those and with the rates value, and it quite quickly became clear that the information that was held centrally on the businesses right across Scotland wasn't up to speed. Appreciate it was the quickest and easiest way to get money out to businesses, but I think my role, Mr Clark's role and other colleagues across Scotland was through discussions with members, through the discussions with the groups that we all sat on at an individual level, was pointing out those small discrepancies. When we think about a system that was based on rates, and we provided examples such as a stance or a yard or a showroom, and digging into those details, and where we found differences across the country on the levels of I suppose staff that local authorities had to be able to deal with those individual cases. But I suppose our role within that point was day to day, hour by hour, asking what if and what about this sector. And to jump back to the point that was made earlier about the differences between geography, the support and the turnaround was very much dependent on each local authority and how they were structured. Obviously, a number of businesses, including ourselves, were ready to go. I suppose when COVID hit, we worked at home, half the staff, half the organisation did. Others, local authorities, were sending staff home without any IT equipment. So there was a delay in getting the support available there. As we progressed, obviously Mr Clark and Mr Boland have mentioned the percentage of our business that is either vehicle based or home based, and this was a group that focused on rateable value and not the 50% of other businesses that were there. So from that became the self-employed income support scheme at various different levels across the UK. Again, that produced further gaps in the markets when we looked at company directors, which was a large campaign that we ran right across the UK, and unfortunately just the way that they were structured and the dividend payments meant that we weren't able to get support to them. And then I suppose from those became the other up to 200, 180 different funds that were being highlighted as we progressed. I think it links back to the statement there about the debt. So when businesses are seeing people and other businesses getting payments, there is this, I've run out of that kind of slush fund or the bank that I had now, I need help and I don't fit into this this bracket, and it just spiraled day on day, week on week from there.
Thank you. And you mentioned the 180 funds, which we'll come on to discuss in a bit more detail later. But in paragraph 100 to 107 of this witness statement, you discuss the application process. And again, we'll come on to ask about, or I'll come on to ask you about issues with that process. But just in terms of administration and distribution of the support and the 180 funds that Mr. Groundwater mentioned there, what bodies were responsible for doing that in general terms?
Yeah,
Mr. Clark.
sorry, yes, I'm
Thank you, Mr.
happy to
Clark.
take that. Yeah, initially it was largely down to local authorities to distribute, for example, the funds that were based around the rateable values and the valuation rule. But obviously, as we pointed out, more and more examples of businesses who were being left out by that kind of support, then increasingly more and more bodies became involved in administering grants. So, for example, grants like the early grants like the Pivotal Enterprise Fund was administered by Scottish Enterprise initially. You had the Wedding Funds, which was administered by South of Scotland Enterprise for the whole of Scotland. You had various creative funds, which were administered by Creative Scotland. So, you know, we've found various ways of getting money out to businesses, and of course some of that created its own issues because the processes we'd been used to in terms of dealing with local authorities, you know, were changed when you're dealing with, for example, a national enterprise agency in relation to another fund, and even within the local authorities themselves. I mean, Mr. Groundwater's already raised the issue around, you know, where, you know, in the early stages of the COVID funding, for example, you know, I had local authorities in my region where economic development staff were being put in charge of administering funds. Other areas, for example, some very large local authorities only had a handful of maybe non-domestic rating staff looking after all of that grant support, and that had to be increased, and the local authorities found ways of finding more of their staff to be able to come in and administer some of those funds. But it was very much piecemeal by necessity because, you know, again, as we went through the pandemic and different funds of these 180 were created, sometimes the local authorities weren't able to go back and you know, have the same people do the same jobs because those people were back to doing their day job, which they maybe weren't doing in the early part of the pandemic, and that led to pressure and resources as well.
And just in terms of inconsistencies, what sort of inconsistencies were observed?
Initially, I think the probably the most significant noticeable inconsistency was in the speed of dealing with applications for financial support. So those businesses who had put, for example, for those local authorities rather, who had put enterprise agency, you know, business gateway staff in charge of handling grants, maybe had a more day-to-day knowledge of the local business community and could say, well, actually this, you know, for example, I'll give you an example of a retail business applying for support under the grant where the support was for retail tourism and hospitality businesses. In some local authorities, the support staff, the business gateway staff who were dealing with applications would know probably the business itself and would know that that business was a retail business. In other local authorities where you didn't have economic development staff dealing with applications, then you might have a situation where the staff dealing with the application were looking at the non-domestic rate valuation rule and saying, you know, this is a business unit, this isn't a retail unit, so therefore this isn't a retail business. But actually, if you look at the nature of the business itself, it was conducting retail business, but maybe not from a traditional retail business unit.
So inconsistencies in terms of time, but also in terms of criteria that were being applied, is that?
Yeah, we certainly found that as well. You know, Mr. Groundwater's mentioned, you know, some of those differences in terms of how properties are termed on the valuation rule. You know, and he's mentioned that sort of you know, the stances, etc. I mean, I think it was intended to be that some properties were given a title which indicated that they were not perhaps actively economic, they were sort of passively economic, like a yard, for example. But where you have a yard where maybe caravan sales are being conducted from, that's very different to a storage yard. So we had to make those arguments with local government to try and convince people that this is actually the intention of the support. Mr. Groundwater, I think, would have more to add there.
Yeah, thank you. I think there were two other main differences for me, and that was in a lot of the funds, each individual local authority took a different approach to the application process. So some were very quick at making online applications available. Some insisted on paper copies and being printed and sent in. There was a turnaround time that took for that. So along with and the other point would have been along with the kind of how much risk they were prepared to take, how quickly they wanted to get that money and support at the door. What was the appetite, depending on, as Mr. Clark said, the kind of local knowledge? Is it economic development staff where we have large numbers, or is it somebody else from a different team that's been seconded? How much of an approach was the local authority prepared to take? And we saw that across the country, where we were obviously speaking on an hourly basis sometimes about examples where we could pitch and say this yard or stance in one local authority area has received support. However, here's an example, somebody doing exactly the same thing, the next door authority or a couple hundred miles away being rejected from that. So those were the kind of inconsistencies that we were highlighting on a day-to-day basis. And I think when you have a government programme, obviously Mr. Clark's mentioned the other support that was available through the enterprise agencies, one application form going out and then to be paid, but to have one set of guidance and rules that could be interpreted in slightly different ways across 32 authorities with 32 different application processes was one of the big challenges that we fought right at the start.
Thank you very much. We'll come on to discuss just the challenges specifically with the valuation role-based support and eligibility criteria in a bit more detail. But before we do, there's reference in a few places in the witness statement to a lack of data about the business community in Scotland and issues arising for that. For example, in paragraphs 115 and 129, there's reference to that. So as I said, we'll come on to discuss specific issues relating to valuation role as a proxy, but in general terms, what were the implications of the Scottish Government and local authorities lacking comprehensive data on the small business community in Scotland, or to what extent was that data lacking? If you could expand on that a bit more, please.
I mean, I think Mr. Groundwater and Mr. Clark have already sort of explained a lot of that. I mean, it was an imperfect proxy. The advantage of using the valuation role is it's there, it's done, you know, and you're ready to go with it. But it was designed to enable the collection of non-domestic rates. It wasn't designed to facilitate the smooth administration of emergency grant support. And again, as my colleagues have said, the issues around about misclassifications, how it's interpreted, who was interpreting it, gave rise to anomalies, but it also then led to us in a situation where, because we were basing it on that, gaps would emerge. So then a patch would go on top of that gap, fill that gap, then another patch would go on top of that. Then as things dragged on, we might want to, for example, repeat a particular scheme, but that scheme might have changed its name, or it might have been administered by something different. And the new person who was administering it might not have a data sharing agreement with the people who administered it last time. So a lot of that spiralled and became more and more and more complicated, and it all stemmed from that initial issue about the lack of reliable local economic data.
And has that been addressed subsequently? Was that ever an issue before, that lack of data about Scottish businesses?
I mean, it's not a new issue. It's just, I think that the COVID brought it into real stark relief and pushed up the priority list. I would refer to my colleagues, but I don't recall anything formal. But that has changed. I think we still are where we were.
Yeah, I would agree with that. You know, if you look at the Businesses in Scotland annual publication that the Scottish Government publishes, you know, you'll see a fairly exact number in terms of the number of VAT registered businesses in Scotland. But if you look at the overall number of businesses in Scotland, which is, you know, a couple of 100,000 higher than the number of VAT registered businesses, it's an estimate, and it still is. And absolutely, you know, you know, when we were looking at the businesses that were coming to us in that early part of COVID who weren't receiving support, you know, the local, you know, economic development departments and certainly the Scottish Government had very little to go on in terms of who are these businesses. You know, I had people come to me who were running boat trips from Eyemouth, so vehicle-based businesses. I had someone, a cleaning business from Midlothian, come to me saying, where's my support? But they were based from home and had a van that went round, you know, where they would, you know, clean people's properties or offices. So, you know, none of these businesses were on the valuation roll. So there is a question of how we identify these businesses and get support to them.
And just in terms of that, I mean, are there other countries, either within the UK or out of the UK, that have an alternative, a database of businesses that's an alternative to just using the valuation role that was done in Scotland?
I think we're straying rather far from our sphere of expertise in this one, I think. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Don't know. Okay, no, that's fair enough. And we have had some discussion about the valuation role and challenges of that, but just taking a step back, it obviously was used because of a lack of data on Scottish businesses. Could you please just explain in practical terms how it was used?
Essentially, going through the valuation role where the business is categorised, and then deciding, using that categorisation to identify the intended recipients of particular pieces of support.
So on that valuation role, would it, for example, say this is a retail business, therefore it qualifies for
it's a retail premises.
So it's based on the premises, retail premises versus.
And yeah, as opposed to a warehouse, you know, and or a factory. And you know, as we've discussed, you can obviously carry on different types of businesses from different types of premises. So Mr. Clark's example of, you know, something that's designated as a storage yard, but actually it's a used car lot. Mm-hmm. You know, and there's a tiny little porta cabin from which the paperwork's done. You know, it's about getting to the character of the business. And if you had people who were mechanically applying that test, that threw up anomalies. If it was people who said, no, wait a minute, I've known that business for 20 years, this is what they do, then it was less of an issue.
So it's not designed for that purpose,
No.
and it kicks up a problem of not accurate reflecting what the nature of the business is doing. We've already touched on accessibility of financial support. I think Mr. Groundwater mentioned some of the differences. But in general terms, how were support schemes advertised? How did people know what support schemes to apply for?
I'll let Mr. Groundwater answer that one.
Thank you.
Again, that approach varied depending on the local authority. If it was the local authority that was indeed administrating that fund, some were very proactive. In the north east of Scotland in particular, where there was adverts taken out in the local press and in both print and broadcast. They were using the various network groups that myself and colleagues sat on sometimes daily to advertise the funds, and they were giving us updates on the applications that were received and trying to push. Others didn't need to take that approach. Again, going back to the previous comments about the departments that existed and how well the economic development team knew their business base, and they were directly support, or sometimes there was, just again through engagement, databases that they were able to direct constantly. Other times was them, in terms of agencies and others, asking all the other partners to promote, be that through the daily and the hourly, the minute by minute conversations we were having with members on the phone saying, did you know about this, through social media, email shots, anything and everything. I think most of the broadcast interviews that we were doing, or certainly that I was doing across the North East, always finished with, check out this website if you're based in Aberdeen, or the general one that developed through Fine Business Support for further information about the funds. As you can imagine, as COVID kind of grew and the funds grew, it became very difficult to be up to speed on 180 different funds that were available. I remember being asked to attend a business group in Murray and asked to be talked about COVID support, and the question was which part, who's the audience, and then you quickly found that we're talking about 20, 30 different funds to direct people to. So it was a mixture across the board. I don't know if Gary has anything to add from his experience.
Yeah, I would just probably add that, you know, for us it was a complex process trying to, you know, figure out how each fund worked and who it was. You know, there was information out there, most of it online, about the broad features of a fund and who it was intended for and how to apply for it. But Mr. Groundwater and I, particularly dealing with businesses on the front line, were often referring to things like non-domestic rates practice notes for each of the funds, which, whilst they were available publicly on the Scottish Government website, may have been sufficiently technical that a lot of businesses might not have been able to get their heads around, okay, do I even have a process of appeal here? If so, what do I base my appeal on? And it was very complex to be able to do that. Now, we had experience of not only multiple businesses within the same local authority or different local authorities, we were also consulting with each other, as Mr. Groundwater says, on a daily basis, and consulting with colleagues like Mr. Borland, who are dealing with Scottish Government officials, to be able to make sense of all these rules and bring them together and fight successful cases for our members.
Yeah.
But that's a particularly difficult process for an individual, perhaps feeling quite alone, to be able to navigate themselves.
I think, sorry,
Yes.
I think this is also worth making the point that not all local authorities were quite as proactive as the ones that Mr. Groundwater mentioned, and a few rather sat back and waited for people to approach them. And that obviously raises it, or contacted people with whom they were already in contact. And that obviously has an effect, because we know there are certain parts of the business community who are less likely to access that sort of publicly available support. So if you're waiting for people to contact you, or contacting people with whom you have an existing relationship, then that just exacerbates that inequality.
And do you have any particular groups in mind, of the business community in mind?
For example, ethnic minority-owned businesses are less likely to engage with traditional business support structure.
And we've heard a fair bit so far in the inquiry about digital inclusion or exclusion, and to what extent, obviously, I think Mr. Groundwater mentioned some applications were paper-based, some were digital, but just in terms of accessing the funding and having to find information about funding, to what extent was digital inclusion or exclusion an issue for some business owners in terms of actually knowing where to go if they weren't your members, for example?
That was an issue, particularly for older business owners, after the application process was online only. So again, another barrier that was put in their way.
Thank you. In terms of the actual delivery of funding and challenges in terms of getting support out to businesses, so assuming somebody actually manages to know what to apply for, could you please provide a bit of detail about the issues, if any, experienced with the delivery of specific, maybe with an example of a specific kind? You mentioned the discretionary fund, for example. What were the issues, if any, in relation to delivery and getting the funds out?
I'll defer to Mr. Clark on that one.
Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Yeah, I think this might be a wee bit of a team effort, because we
As
came
long as we know
across
who's answering what, that's fine.
we came across quite a few issues across the country, because by its very nature, the discretionary fund was up to local authorities and individual local authorities to administer. So we did find, things happen in 32 different ways there. But I think if we look at the creation of the discretionary fund, which was back in sort of October, November of 2020, it was a fund designed to sort of plug some of the gaps in support that we've been talking about. But it was specifically initially imagined around the different tiers of restriction that the country was under at that time. I think it was tier 1 to 4, from the lowest to the highest level of restriction. And local authorities received funding based upon which tier they were in. Particularly the tier 4 local authorities received a bit more of an allocation from the discretionary fund. Now, at the time the fund was created, in that autumn of 2020, I think 11 local authorities in Scotland were under the highest tier of restrictions, tier 4. But by the time the money was given to local authorities to begin to distribute to businesses, or to find ways of distributing to businesses, it had reached January 2021, by which point I think 29 out of the 32 local authorities were in tier 4 levels of restrictions. And of course, we had changed the nature of how support was given, so it wasn't universal support given to every business, which had, because every business had closed its doors in spring 2020. By the beginning of 2021, restrictions were then based upon whether a business could open. So if a business was told to close, then it could apply for funding. But if it wasn't told to close, then it could continue to stay open, but it wouldn't receive any funding. And of course, the issues we had there were things like obvious cases like kennels and catteries, which were deemed to be essential animal support and humane support for animals, but they had no customers because nobody's putting their dog or cat into kennels or catteries because nobody's going on a holiday. They can't even leave their own local authority area, never mind put their animals into support. But these businesses didn't receive automatic support because by law they weren't asked to close. So these are the sorts of businesses that the discretionary fund was aimed at addressing. So we found, first of all, the money went to local authorities in January, but the guidance didn't get issued until, probably defer to colleagues here, but I think it was March of 2021. So there was a period of 2 months where local authorities had the money to give out to businesses, but didn't have the guidance from the Scottish Government as to how to do that. Yet despite that, some local authorities had managed to distribute all of their money before the guidance came out. Others took the view that we'll wait until the guidance comes out before we start making big allocations from this. You had other local authorities still who said we're not going to tell anyone about this fund and wait till people come to us, and we've touched upon that earlier and the difficulties that can cause for particular types of businesses. And then you had businesses or local authorities later on who made up their own rules, which were contrary to the Scottish Government guidance, and distributed funds based on their own rules and ignored the Scottish Government guidelines for distribution of funds. So it became a very complicated fund, and a fund which initially was £30 million across the whole of Scotland was rapidly extended to £120 million by sort of April of 2021. And one of the frustrations that we had dealing with local authorities and Scottish Government on a day-to-day basis is that there was very little appetite from the public sector to learn the lessons of how the first £30 million was spent before the next £90 million was allocated to them. So, Mr. Groundwater, if you want to
I think
maybe add.
Just two very quick points. I think in terms of the speed of payment, again, that varied depending on the local authority area and how they were set up. Some had quite clear payment days and a role that was out there, so you were able to advise the members and indeed businesses that were maybe chasing for those funds about the actual process. Some were very open about that. And the other point goes back to, I think, the data that is held. So when you have a discretionary fund and businesses that may be based in one local authority but actually operating in the neighbour local authority on different levels and different support available, that became quite a challenge. Just because I'm based in Clackmannanshire, but actually 100% of my business is in Perth and Kinross, if I was a mile or across the road in some circumstances, I'd be able and eligible for this fund. However, because of postcode, I'm not. So that became a huge challenge that, again, the discussions with local authorities were trying to resolve, but as Mr. Clark's highlighted, there was some more willingness with some than others.
And I think, Mr. Clark, you mentioned some local authorities ignoring guidance and doing their own thing. Do you have any specific examples of the types of funding that, or you don't have to mention local authorities, but the types of funding that they would have?
Yes, I mean, to give a basic example, the Scottish Government guidelines for local authorities using discretionary funds said that had you received a UK-wide financial support, so for example the self-employed income support scheme or using the furlough scheme, that was not a bar to applying to the discretionary fund. But for example, Westhuizen Counsel applied a bar in those circumstances and would not give support from the discretionary fund to businesses which had previously received either self-employed income support or had used the furlough scheme for staff, and that was, that was different to every other local authority in Scotland, that as far as I'm aware, and also that was contrary to the guidance that had been issued to them.
Thank you. Thought you had something more, Mr. Groundwater. Not. You mentioned at the start, or we discussed at the start, the gaps that you identified in funding and how that kind of became something that you had to continue doing through the pandemic. You've mentioned the discretionary fund, which was designed to fill some of the gaps in the others, but to what extent did later rounds of financial support, such as address some of the gaps identified earlier, or were there still ongoing gaps that weren't filled either by the discretionary fund for reasons other than the ones you've articulated there, that there were just gaps within funding?
I think I'll ask Mr. Clark to take that one.
I think the obvious one there is one Mr. Groundwater's mentioned earlier, which would be company directors who are paid by dividend. Now, many of those businesses could apply for the discretionary fund, but again, it depends on the local authority that they were based in, because some local authorities chose to spend that money very specifically and for very specific purposes and to support very specific types of businesses. Other local authorities, it was a far more general support where anyone could apply for it. But you know, generally speaking, if you were a company director paid by dividends from the company, then there was no direct support available to you. And as Mr. Groundwater has mentioned, that's something similar to the self-employed income support scheme that we had lobbied for with the UK government, but sadly on this occasion we were unsuccessful. So I think that's a big category of business types who were left out, and you know, you've found all these groups, lobby groups, almost set up by these types of people who were losing out on this support to lobby up specifically for that kind of support. As I say, some of them did receive support under the discretionary fund, but not all.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to add, one of the other key groups that was missed out was one of Mr. Clark's favourites, I suppose, in terms of engagement and the lobbying, and that was the bed and breakfast
yes,
sector.
I was going to come on to ask you about that, because obviously there's mention in the, I think, the witness statement and possibly also in the Rule 8 about complexities and anomalies with later funding, and I think examples are given of the bed and breakfast and I think the Omicron funding as well. Perhaps you could start with the bed and breakfast funding and just give examples of the complexities and anomalies that emerged with that funding, and then perhaps one of you can take the Omicron as well, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to take the bed and breakfast issue. It's just one of those emblematic issues that I think shows the difficulties right the way through the pandemic and the different types of support that were available at various stages of the pandemic. So this kind of all stems from the initial support which was available to businesses which were paying non-domestic rates on the valuation rule. Now, some bed and breakfast properties are rated, business rated, and because they pay business rates and they're a retail, hospitality, leisure type of business, then they received direct support in that initial tranche of government support based on business rates. However, not all bed and breakfast businesses are rated for business rates. Some of them pay council tax. So the second round of support that was created for these types of businesses was the Creative Tourism and Hospitality Fund, which was administered by Scottish Enterprise. So if you had a bed and breakfast property, which was where you paid council tax rather than business rates, and had a business bank account, then you could receive support under that fund. But then we had bed and breakfasts come to us and say, but I don't have a business bank account. So they then created a third fund, which is the, I can't even remember the name of the fund now, it's the Bed and Breakfast Hardship Fund, which was specifically for those businesses, bed and breakfasts, paying council tax, and with a personal rather than a business bank account. So in 3 stages, it kind of got there in the end and covered every B&B in Scotland. But then when the government, in the early part of 2021 was looking to repeat support, it repeated the non-domestic rate support. So those B&Bs who paid business rates got repeated support. It repeated the Bed and Breakfast Hardship Fund. So those B&Bs paying council tax and with no business bank account received support. But the group in the middle who'd received support under the Creative Tourism and Hospitality Fund, because that fund was not repeated in the same format, those B&Bs who paid council tax but had a business bank account didn't receive any support. So we pointed that out to Scottish Government. argued the case with officials. They recognised that there was a problem here, and then they went back and re-established, or sort of basically created a new fund which would cover both the council tax paying B&Bs, whether they basically had a business bank account or not. So that way everyone was covered. But it kind of shows that by taking one sector and covering it with 3 different funds, when you came to repeat that support, because restrictions had continued, and in some cases, where businesses were continuing to have to stay closed, replicating that support where you had 3 funds and someone had forgotten that actually part of this sector was covered under one fund became very complex, and that was a real issue in terms of bed and breakfast.
Thank you. And then Omicron and the complexities with that.
Omicron funding, I'll come back. I'll just, I suppose, carrying on the story of bed and breakfasts, a year later, in beginning of 2022, when Omicron support, the Omicron wave, which was identified in late 2021, the government recognised that there was a downturn in the tourist market and created a new fund of Omicron support for businesses affected by that. Now that was largely, in large part, accommodation type businesses, but it restricted that support to hotels. And actually no bed and breakfasts or guest houses received any automatic support under the Omicron wave of funding, which, in my area, I was dealing with the City of Edinburgh Council, and I was dealing with business guest houses, B&Bs, who'd taken bookings for Edinburgh's Hogmanay, who'd taken bookings for the Six Nations Internationals in sort of January, February, March, who had seen bookings just cancelled left, right and centre. And, my argument was, well, why are these businesses not receiving the same support as hotels? So actually, the City of Edinburgh Council in that case created a new fund from its unspent discretionary fund support to be able to recompense some of the businesses affected by that in those restrictions. So, but that wasn't universal. It wasn't all the way across Scotland. Some local authorities like Highland took the view that this was winter and tourism is more seasonal in the Highlands, and maybe they shouldn't receive that support in winter, but still hotels were compensated and B&Bs weren't. I don't know if...
I think you've covered it quite well there, yeah.
Thank you very much. We've touched on the delays and timing issues and sort of postcode lottery or differences across geographic regions in relation to that. But just in a nutshell, what were the key issues around the timing and delivery of financial support for the small businesses themselves, if any?
I mean, I guess at the top level, it's the same issue around about some of the guidance around about lockdown rules and other restrictions. That dislocation between the high-level pronouncement and then how that would then translate into the regulations that would back it up, and then and the guidance that would flow from that, and some of those gaps. Because it's fairly true to say, if you're a business owner watching this and you're told the following is happening, they will tend to assume it is happening now. So what do I need to do? I don't want to break the law. I want to do the right thing. What do I need to do now? And answering those questions, or what am I eligible for? Answering those questions became difficult because of those gaps.
Thank you. There's, starting at paragraph, just moving on now to feedback and monitoring of financial support. We've already touched on the fact that there were 180 schemes. You discuss at paragraph 127 of the witness statement about the feedback and monitoring of the financial support. I'll be asking you in a moment specifically about FSB's engagement with Audit Scotland, but just in very general terms, based on your observations at the time and subsequently, how effectively were those financial support schemes monitored and evaluated by the Scottish Government, and what were some of the issues around that, if any?
I think it was fair to say there was a degree of opacity round about that in terms of what the difference between funds being actually spent and allocated was a debate that went on for some time. I think, and the question of all funds have been allocated, doing quite a lot of heavy lifting in some of these conversations. I think, as I mentioned before, there was some cases where as things went on, funds could be folded into each other or renamed, so tracking them from start to finish was quite difficult. I mean, I think, again, Mr. Clark, you've got a couple of examples of specific funds that you were asking questions about. I don't know if you wanted to talk about them.
Yeah, I suppose looking at a couple of funds, I mean, one fund might be the Business Ventilation Fund, where the initial announcement was £25 million of government support we put into helping businesses to become safer through better ventilation and better monitoring of air quality in the business. But there was a report came out, but that was announced I think in the September. The fund went live I think in the November, and was live all the way through to I think the beginning of April. And at the end of it, it was found that only just under £1 million of that £25 million was spent for its intended purpose. And we know of members. I know of a member in Edinburgh, for example, who applied 3 times to that fund to try and get a £200 carbon dioxide monitor for their health studio, and kept on getting turned back and turned back and turned back. And FSB had to intervene to try and argue their case. They were ultimately successful, but perhaps that was one reason why so little of that fund was spent. But of course, we then asked the question, well, where is the remaining £24 million being allocated? And I think the answer we got from government was, well, that money's been allocated. It's not gone to the businesses who it was intended to support. So what happens to that money? And I think, with Omicron funding as well, I think it was initially announced that I think £375 million of funding had been set aside to support businesses through the Omicron wave. But in terms of the actual announcements of various funds, that came to quite a bit less than that. I think about 275. I think it's in the evidence that we've got the exact number. And of that, only around just under 200 million was actually spent. When you look at the government's spending figures, yeah, 267 million pounds was announced out of the 375 million, and only 154 million was actually spent. So when we're arguing the case saying, but what about these businesses over here who have not received support, and the government says we've got no money to support them, and we ask the question, well, what about the money you didn't spend here? That money's already been allocated. So, Mr. Borland's right, it did seem quite opaque, some of the decision making. And again, going back to discretionary funds, the initial £30 million given to local authorities was done by means of grant letter and was supposed to be spent by the end of March 2021. The additional £90 million given to local authorities was done through the revenue support grant. So the local authorities didn't have the same reporting criteria to say how that money was spent. And we did find out after a year or so after that there was quite a substantial degree of unspent discretionary funding from local authorities. But it was difficult to see, other than we know you've spent this amount of money, but where did the rest go?
Thank you. Any other comments on that before I ask you about your engagement with Audit Scotland?
I suppose the final another point would be about the reporting that local authorities and other partner agencies had to the Scottish Government, and that was again differed across the country, going back to probably that point about staffing. But the key point, announced, allocated and spend, the timeline between that was very, very different. And Mr. Boland's point about funds being merged into each other, when we're looking at those different funds and as we grow over a period of time, slight changes, as Mr. Clark's announced, said about the bed and breakfast funds and how those change over time, or an announcement about breweries and five-a-side football funds that then are separate and then get merged into one fund for reporting mechanisms, became very, very difficult to track over time as part of our submission to Audit Scotland, in terms of the funds that we've identified from announcement to spend to date, or allocated to date to spend to date. But again, it just differed depending on the local authority and on those calls that we were having on a daily basis. We would get information about that, be able to monitor in terms of the announcement that was made, or even the high numbers of businesses that we were hearing that were being rejected, and making those lobbying calls by highlighting you have this discretionary fund that is 70% unutilised. let's make sure it gets out by the date, if there was one, by the March one, or indeed the subsequent top-up.
Thank you. And Mr. Borland, did you have anything
No.
to add to that? Oh, I thought you were taking a breath to speak. Again, we've mentioned or discussed this 180 different schemes that you managed to sort of pull together from the data available. Did those include Scottish and UK funds, or were those just the Scottish funds? Support schemes?
They were just Scotland. Yes, they were just Scotland, yeah.
Just the Scottish ones, thank you. Could you then, you've referred to it in your statement and in your Rule 8 response, but could you just briefly explain how FSB came to engage with Audit Scotland and what that engagement involved?
I believe, if memory serves, Audit Scotland approached us when they were carrying out this exercise, and that's what prompted us. We had been informally tracking those schemes for some time, in terms of looking at who had set it up, how much was in it, how much was spent, when did it start, when did it end, that sort of thing. And we had collated that together into that spreadsheet, which I think is certainly part of a Rule 8 submission, if not part of the evidence bundle, and submitted that to Audit Scotland. And I think they followed that up, if memory serves, with a discussion with them, just to sort of essentially tease out the points that Mr. Clark and Mr. Groundwater have made about what it was looking like from where we were sitting. And again, it was interesting to see their conclusion about finding out where that 1.1 billion went after it went into reserves.
Yes, you did you provide feedback to other bodies other than Audit Scotland, or was it just an Audit Scotland exercise?
Trying to think back in terms of our various engagement, we did give evidence to the Scottish Affairs Committee at House of Commons on its inquiry into the pandemic and lessons, which I think was that last year, I think 2023. We gave evidence there. Like along similar lines. I think the evidence we gave to Audit Scotland was along similar lines to what we've given to this inquiry.
Yeah, happy enough that. I mean, the feedback was also to local authorities. We know how much money has been allocated. You're reporting how much has been spent. Therefore, what's happened with the remainder? I suppose if you ask the question of the Scottish Government, they will say the money has been allocated to the local authorities and it's up to them to administer those funds and get those payments out the door. So the point on the 180 or the data collection on the spreadsheets was also for our point of view, not just for reporting at the end of this, but to keep track when you have so many businesses and members getting in touch. You need to have that kind of short, sharp overview of what is the fund, so we track the kind of sectors and a brief note about who it might be applicable to, so that we could quickly keyword search or refer to it and say, you might be eligible for this, here's the link, here's the agency that's administrating it or the local authority.
Thank you. And oops, Mr. Clark.
So, I just want to David, Mr. Groundwater's raised that issue there in terms of, going back and looking at the officially published data, which we did, often in a local authority by local authority basis. And, that data would tell you how many applications were successful, how many were unsuccessful, and the total funding issued. And of course, in some areas, we sort of knew what the local grant, say for discretionary fund, was. And if you multiplied that by the number of grants, you ended up with a different number to the overall amount spent. So in a number of cases, we went back to the local authorities and said, well, can you explain why this doesn't add up? So in some cases, for example, Fife Council, Fife had, like many local authorities, had just doubled up. So if they'd given, say, a £2,000 grant to someone who'd applied for the discretionary fund and had money left, they just said, have 4 instead of 2. And they just doubled it up to the people who'd already applied. And then another example was Westhuizen Council, which had invited 51, 53, something like that, businesses to apply for a higher level of grant, which was not an open application process so far as we could determine. And those questions there over the compatibility with Scottish Government guidance. But it provided a higher level of support to a number of businesses who it had invited. And that then helped us add up the numbers. But a lot of that information wasn't publicly available, and we had to make specific representations to find out exactly how the money was spent.
Thank you. And then notwithstanding those investigations and sort of tying the numbers together, in paragraph 127 of your witness statement, you said it's hard to disagree with Audit Scotland's conclusion that it is difficult to see how over 1.1 billion of of COVID-19 funding was spent after it was put into reserves. And in footnote 12, you quote a document, Scotland's financial response to the COVID-19, and that's a document by Audit Scotland dated June 2022. Is that 1.1 billion the sort of sum total of these amounts that you were referring to earlier in terms of not being able to marry the sums up in terms of what was allocated and what was distributed? Is that what you're referring to there?
I believe so, yes. But we need to double check the Audit Scotland report and what it says, because that's their number.
Yeah, I think a proportion of that would be able to be traced, but not all of it. I think is the thrust of the Audit Scotland report. But yeah, that's a quote from their report.
Thank you. With which you don't disagree?
No.
Time permitting, I'm going to give you an opportunity just at the end of your evidence to comment on potential lessons to be learned. But before we move on to discuss other pandemic guidance, and I see we're at 11 minutes past 12, so we don't have a huge amount of time left, I'll just invite you, are there any other significant issues you want to raise in relation to funding and or any specific lessons learned specifically around financial support provided to small businesses during the pandemic that you'd want to highlight now? And you do have a section on it which we have in your report under financial support lessons, but are there any that you want to flag out specifically now? Please do.
I mean, I'm conscious of time. I think paragraph 133, we have a number, we've sort of listed a number of observations, and we've covered a lot of ground this morning, and I think most of them are in there, talking about who was actually doing administering, who was making the decisions, who was getting what turned out to be significant. Multiple schemes to cover particular sectors gave rise to issues. There were practical questions about data sharing between agencies as well, so we couldn't necessarily replicate. There was an issue, I don't know if we've spoken about it specifically, but there was an issue with somewhere there wasn't automatic appeals. So we had to then go and talk specifically to the official who had, or the agency that had taken the decision. So if there was a sort of standard set of appeals and rights, so that would probably have made things easier. Having all the everything available online again would be particularly helpful. We may talk about it a little bit later, but some of the changes in terms of how they were communicated.
Yes.
The change of £1 in a threshold could actually have significant impacts on how much a business gets. But if that guidance changed, what we would find is it would simply be published on the Scottish Government website, and rather than helpfully the previous version of it would be taken down, but with no track changes, so we didn't know what had changed. So you've read a 50-page guidance document, you then got to go back and look over that again. So again, that sort of flagging up what's actually changed, what shifted.
Well, we can come on to discuss that. We do have a bit of time, so if we can move on then just to discuss other pandemic rules and guidance, and please feel free in this discussion to refer to anything that applies to the funding as well as general guidance in terms of closures and openings, etc. Just bearing in mind our time, if we could start with timing, and you refer in paragraph 134, you make comments about the timing of guidance. Could you please comment on the timing of the rules and guidance, and as you've mentioned there, the changes to the guidance issued by the Scottish Government during the pandemic, and whether and to what extent this caused issues for FSB and or small businesses?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we touched on, there was an issue with, you would see the high level announcement, whether at the daily updates or in the Parliament, and then there would be a gap between what that was going to look like in practice, and inevitably practical questions would come up. I mean, I recall the issues round about the distinction between what constitutes a cafe and what constitutes a restaurant, and there'd been no actual reliable definition of either, and casting about and trying to find some indicative factors that might be able to factor in. That was one of countless examples of people who were really keen to do the right thing, didn't want to fall foul of the rules, but were saying, can you tell me what these rules are? So there was definitely an issue with timing there. And then following on from the regulations, the issues about the guidance, and then questions about how that guidance would be enforced locally. So that, and some of that we don't know, but it seemed like it was being held up. The delay, the hold up was at the centre. So perhaps more sort of devolved decision making or something like that to speed that up would have been helpful. Yes.
You've touched there on the next thing I was going to ask you about was in terms of the clarity of the guidance. How clear were the rules and guidance, and how easy were they to follow and understand?
It was very difficult, I think, for a typical business owner, particularly one who's maybe in something like, a customer-facing or a public-facing role. I think, again, as I mentioned, when these, again, the same applies actually as did with the grants, that you could have a change in guidance, but if you're not telling us what the changes actually are, you're just replacing one big document with another big document. That's really difficult. A business owner has spent their time going through that, understanding it, and now 2 lines have changed. Now, those changes must have been discussed in a meeting and agreed, so that must have been minuted somewhere. So it's not a question of resources or time to highlight what those changes are and put them in a different colour in the document. And that's simple. That should happen as standard, but again, despite repeated representations from us, it didn't.
And just in terms of communication of guidance, were there any particular issues with the way in which the guidance was communicated, all the rules and guidance was communicated?
I think things is dropping onto our website.
Pardon?
I think if issues with things is dropping onto websites, people expecting it to be found was an issue, and notwithstanding the point about letting us know what had changed. I don't know, Gary, was it clear?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of an example which I think was round about the Business Ventilation Fund, where the guidance actually changed before the fund went live. So the guidance was published before the fund went live, and then was amended again, still before the fund went live. And, you kind of read it and think, right, this is what we need to tell our members about. But then they changed the rules before it actually went live, and you had to kind of go back and think. And again, the point that Mr. Borland's raised there about, a 50-page document is replaced by another 50-page document, when all we need to know, and all our members need to know, is what's changed. What do I need to do different this week than I did last week? And that's difficult when they've not told you what's changed. They've just replaced the entire document. I think that's a big issue. I don't know, Mr. Groundwater.
Yeah, I think the descriptions that were used as well, the general language in plain English that was used. Mr. Borland mentioned elderly earlier on in terms of digital exclusion. We've talked about those with language challenges and issues, English not being their first language. How do you interpret that 50-page document when all that you're pointed to is updated section on criteria being the key part that we're looking for? The timing of the guidance, as Mr. Borland has said, that the time between, or even the briefs that we were maybe provided with in terms of what's coming up, I don't think any session of Parliament or broadcast from be it the First Minister or other Cabinet Secretaries have been so popular, because people were at home, people were watching television, they were seeing things and automatically picking up that phone straight away. Does this apply to me? But also going back to the descriptions that were used, we talked about rateable value being those descriptions. When you have in guidance, this applies to X description, and then you have the, but what about me? This is what I do in my business, became very difficult. And again, further rereads of 1, 2, 3 sets of guidance. This isn't applicable to your business. However, this one is, or that one might be, or both are, was the challenge for many.
And Ms. Groundwater, you mentioned the language issue, and specifically people who don't speak English, and with the guidance coming out, voluminous guidance coming out in English. How did FSB seek to address language barriers to ensure non-English speaking members could access the guidance? I think there is reference to this in the witness statement.
In our statement, yes, indeed. So we had a couple of different tools, and that was again through active members that we had. One example we cite in the statement is in Aberdeen, where we had a Romanian member who was receiving lots of questions from fellow Romanians across the city who were not necessarily members, but again, as Mr. Borland said in the opening remarks, we were there to help all businesses and members. Generally, we did not really have the time to search up membership status, but we're above that. We wanted to help everyone. So we quickly set up events with that member. We would use online facilities on Facebook. We had the translation services, or we would get the questions in to the member, who would then send them to us. We would then provide the answers, and we would go back in that direction. At UK level, and it's still a feature that's on our website, you can translate into over 100 different languages through the Recite Me function. This was tested by a number of colleagues. We've one Japanese colleague who quickly looked at the Japanese section and was able to say, yes, that's ideal. But again, with information changing on an hour-by-hour basis, sometimes it's very difficult to keep up with those things. So in general, it was the kind of high level, as we move through the pandemic, the kind of level structures and maybe the UK-wide things that were on our website. Others were relying on, we know somebody locally who can help, be it Polish, Lithuanian, Romanian, across the board. And
language aside, you touched on interpretation issues there as well, just in your previous answer, and paragraphs 147 to 150 of the witness statement discusses issues that arose as a consequence of guidance requiring interpretation, and the fact that this led to inconsistent decision-making and application. Are you able to provide examples of how the interpretation of guidance led to inconsistent application in decision-making, and what the consequences were of that for business? And I think just the specific mention of, I think, medical care versus recreational physiotherapy or tanning salons, and differences in that in two local authorities.
Yeah, I remember getting inquiries from physiotherapists who were members running physiotherapy practices, and actually one of them was 2 practices across 2 different local authorities, which creates its own issues sometimes. But yeah, there was an example there around what can I reopen for, because the physiotherapy that they could, under the guidance, provide was sort of medical physiotherapy rather than physio that maybe almost sort of bordering on massage, which would be more sort of recreational. It had to be sort of like sports physio type work, which they were allowed to do, but they weren't allowed to do other types of physio and non-urgent sorts of treatments. The other one around about the tanning salons was a question of that was a debate that came around, I think it was the latter part of 2020, when we had a member with 2 tanning salons. One was in North Lanarkshire, one was in Westhuizen. Now, he had been told by North Lanarkshire Council to close his tanning salon, as that was, they deemed, a close contact service. So he closed both his salons, and he attempted then, because he'd been instructed to close, to claim financial support because he'd been instructed to close those salons. Now, that financial support was forthcoming from North Lanarkshire, but was not forthcoming from Westhuizen, because they said it's not close contact. They said, someone lies down in the tanning bed, the operator is standing at a distance away from them, switches it on or off, that's not close contact. Now, in December 2020, the Scottish Government issued an update to guidance which said that tanning salons should close. And it was one of, I think, 4 different premises at that stage which were subject to the level 4 restrictions and instructed to close. So he was then able to apply to Westhuizen Council, but he asked for it to be backdated. The Westhuizen Council initially refused to backdate that application. And we then made the point, was the guidance change by the Scottish Government, was that a clarification of guidance, or was that new guidance? So in other words, was the Scottish Government clarifying that these tanning salons should have been closed overall at the time and subject to those close contact restrictions, or were they being added to the guidance and being told to close as of December 2020? And it was very difficult to get an answer either from the local authority or for the Scottish Government relating to that. Ultimately, the member did receive a backdated payment from Westhuizen Council to match his payment from North Lanarkshire Council for the same work being done 10 miles apart, but under 2 different local authorities.
Thank you. I don't know if I've got time to just briefly touch on, there's a reference to enforcement gaps, and the paragraph 151 of the witness statement, were there issues what were these issues for business in relation to enforcement of the rules and guidance and the accountability of ensuring compliance, and how big an issue was this?
I mean, I remember we did an advice event with, I think it was environmental health chiefs who were on the ground responsible for implementing these rules and just how stretched they were, because there simply wasn't the capacity. Other people didn't have the power to enforce, and others simply didn't have the capacity. So I think again it's the last bit in that chain from high level pronouncement to regulation to guidance to actual enforcement. And again, that was difficult. We had to work. There were some absolutely wonderful people that we worked with who were incredibly knowledgeable, but getting that knowledge out there from them to our members so we could advise them, this is how this will look. Or if you have an environmental health officer who comes into your premises, if he or she sees this, they'll say, yeah, that's fine. If they see that, you might have an issue. You know, so that was a sort of practical information and guidance that we were just trying to get out there.
Thank you. I'm conscious we've got 4 minutes left. I'm just going to give you the opportunity to flag up any other key issues, any other ongoing impacts, and any potential lessons to be learned that you'd like to highlight.
I mean, I guess the only thing we've maybe not spoken about is just how it felt in terms of the 4 harms and
Yes.
balancing. And we make reference to it in our witness statement, so I won't go into it in detail, but I think there was a feeling, I don't think it's unfair to say, that people felt when it came to the crunch that the business would be down the list a bit. The fact that the idea was expressed to us that, well, we're the public health guys, we don't need to worry about the economy. Now, could you imagine if that was reversed, if we said we're business, we don't care about public health, it would be disgraceful. So I think there was a feeling that it would have, if we were balancing it a little bit more, that it's not a given that the economy is going to survive, it's not a given that those business spaces are going to survive, given the extent to which our local communities depend on a strong, vibrant, small business base. Then there's a wider issue and there's a wider harm just beyond the perhaps the narrow questions of, you know, hospital numbers or other sort of public health indicators.
Thank you. And in terms of...
Mr. Groundwater, Mr. Clark.
Clark or Mr. Groundwater?
I think the one other observation I would make would be, and I think goes back to the different geographical challenges and, you know, the different approaches that were maybe taken during the pandemic. So in our statement we referred to the Aberdeen restrictions that were implemented following an outbreak there, and maybe what didn't happen in other local authority areas as we got on. But some of the lessons to be learned from that particular circumstance are probably reflected in the wider things about the timing and asking a business or telling a business on a Sunday evening that you can then, or you're waiting on a Sunday evening to find out whether you can open on a Monday, are not ideal. I don't think anybody could work like that. So laying things out in a more of a wider timeline would probably be more welcome, ironically, saying that you can open, but at this point. And I think the other key lesson for me is that it's very, very difficult to put a business, any business, into a kind of box in terms of that description. We found that out from the different funds that are available, the different classifications, and indeed the rateable value rule.
Thank you. Mr. Clark?
No, I think both Mr. Ball and Mr. Groundwater have summed that up quite nicely.
Good. Well, you've got 2 minutes if there's anything else, but if not, I may just refer, my Lord, I've mentioned the case studies and I didn't read in just the reference numbers, just in case your Lordship would like to have a look at those. The Aberdeen local lockdown, I think that Mr. Groundwater just referred to, is case study 1, that's SCI FSB XXX 0000, sorry, it's 501. Bed and breakfast sector support case study 2 is SCI FSB XXX 000005. The case study 3, which is the business ventilation fund that was referred to as SCI FSB XXX 000002. And case study 4, which relates to the discretionary funds that we heard something about, is SCI FSB XXX 000003. Those have all been disclosed to core participants already and form part of the bundle. Unless your Lordship has anything further, I don't have any further questions.
I'm fine, thank you. Gentlemen, I would just like to thank you for your contribution, which is very much appreciated. That's all for today, I think, Miss van der Westhuizen.
It is, my lord. Early day, yes.
Good. Early day, good. And we will convene again at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, my lord.